Thanks, Rolf. This is 9 hard acts to follow. I am daunted, but it's been a thrilling day. I'm delighted to be here. And especially the order in which they're in now, I get to follow Dr. Bertalanffy and talk a bit about brains, a different aspect of brains this time. Okay, contemplate this sentence and see whether you think it's true or false. All right, how many would say, yeah, there aren't any such thing as words? Okay. How many say no, words exist? Okay, good. Just remember that. Okay. This is one of my favorite books. If you're looking for a good book for Christmas, this is a book about Indian street magic by a brilliant philosopher and magician named Lee Siegel. And there's a passage in it which sort of sums up my life in a certain way. He says, I'm writing a book on magic, I explain, and I'm asked, real magic? By real magic, people mean miracles, thaumaturgical acts, supernatural powers. No, I answer, conjuring tricks, not real magic. Real magic, in other words, refers to the magic that's not real. While the magic that is real, that can actually be done, is not real magic. My main work is on consciousness and on free will. And many people believe that if your theory of consciousness, if consciousness doesn't come out to be real magic, then you have not been writing about consciousness. If consciousness isn't real magic, that's sort of, you're changing the subject. Or if you come up with a theory of free will, where free will isn't real magic, then you're not really talking about free will at all. You're talking about, as Kant famously said, a wretched subterfuge. So part of the burden for me is to get people to take seriously a theory of consciousness, human consciousness, where consciousness turns out to be not real magic, but a bag of conjuring tricks. And I can imagine that some of you are already thinking, oh, in other words, he's not going to try to talk about consciousness at all, because consciousness is real magic. Okay, now let's go. This is my favorite, all-time favorite picture of consciousness. It's by Saul Steinberg, New Yorker cover many years ago. This man is looking at a painting, and he's identified the painter as Braque. And that reminds him of the word Baroque, and then Baroque and Bark and Poodle. You get a wonderful stream of consciousness here. And if I left the slide up, you wouldn't listen to me. You would just look and see all of the marvelous associations. This is and of course, it's not just words. There's colors and shapes. You learn quite a lot about this man's conscious life as he's standing in front of this painting. For me, the theory of consciousness that we're looking for, and this is, when I say we, I don't just mean philosophers. I mean, this is the science, the scientific study of consciousness. This is a brilliant metaphorical characterization of consciousness. The way to get at the problem of consciousness from the point of view of science is, if that's the metaphorical truth about what's going on in his head, what's the literal truth that makes it true? If we can explain every detail, the passage from Greenberg to Monteverdi to Verdi, for instance, and how that happened in his stream of consciousness, then we'd have a really good theory of consciousness. Now, before Darwin, this is Darwin year, and I've been going around, evolution is one of my main topics, and I've been going around the world talking about Darwin this year. And I like to point out a strange inversion in his thought. This is the pre-Darwinian worldview, as you know. There's the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's wonderful painting of God putting the finishing touches on Adam, his best creation, but of course still lesser than God himself. This I call the trickle-down theory of creation. Really fancy, wonderful, brilliant, smart thing, making a somewhat less intelligent thing. And so that was the image we had of the world from the beginning of civilization until Darwin came along and proposed the bubble-up theory of creation. And one of his early critics summed it up in a brilliant passage full of passion, which is what Rolf wants. So listen to the passion in this Englishman's outrage when he describes Darwin's book. By the way, the capital letters, they're in the original. In the theory with which we have to deal, absolute ignorance is the artificer, so that we may enunciate as the fundamental principle of the whole system that in order to make a perfect and beautiful machine, it is not requisite to know how to make it. This proposition will be found, on careful examination, to express in condensed form the essential purport of the theory, and to express in a few words all Mr. Darwin's meaning, who, by a strange inversion of reasoning, seems to think absolute ignorance fully qualified to take the place of absolute wisdom in all the achievements of creative skill. Bingo! That's right. That's exactly right. That is what Darwin's all about. It is a strange inversion. It overturns a way of thinking which is older than the species. Never before had anybody thought that such an outrageous thing was possible. This is one of the great moments in science. Now, my other great hero is Alan Turing, who, as much as anybody, deserves the title of the inventor of the computer. And he had his own strange inversion of reasoning, and I want to put them together because they make an interesting pair. Here's a picture of some pre-Turing computers. They're wearing dresses. They studied mathematics in university. Typically, they were mathematicians this was a job. What do you do for a living? I'm a computer. And they were hired by the thousands to work in industry, engineering firms, and so forth. And what they did was they had basically algorithms where they did computation all day long with the help of hand calculators and things like that. So that's pre-Turing computers. In those good old days, computers had to understand arithmetic. They had to appreciate the reasons for what they were doing. This was a fairly skilled job, a high-tech job. And what Turing recognized was that this was not necessary. So now let's put Turing's strange inversion up there. Here's Darwin. In order to make a perfect and beautiful machine, it is not requisite to know how to make it. Here's Turing. In order to be a perfect and beautiful computing machine, it is not requisite to know what arithmetic is. The CPU doesn't know what arithmetic is, but it does perfect arithmetic, and that's the basis for computers. So put them both together, and what they both do, and this was stunning, this is why they're so similar, is they are discovering the possibility of what I call competence without comprehension. In the case of natural selection, it's the competence of this mindless, ignorant process to produce all the beautiful things of the biosphere. No comprehension required. In the case of Turing, it's the competence of this computing machine, this Turing machine, to do not just arithmetic, but to compute all computable functions without any comprehension down at the bottom layer. The implication of both these inversions is the same. That understanding, that mind, consciousness, intention, is not the first cause of it all. It's an effect, and a fairly recent effect at that. You get intelligence and mind later, not at the beginning. Here are two artifacts made by multicellular organisms. On the left, we have a termite castle. On the right, we have, of course, La Sagrada Familia by Antonio Gaudí. I chose these examples because, on the one hand, they're so similar. I mean, strikingly similar. And not just on the outside. On the inside, there's many similarities. Materials are not so different. But in spite of the similarities, which are manifest, I want to claim the design and construction of these two artifacts could not be more different. There's a world of difference between the way these two things came into existence. On the left, we have the termites, and the termites are clueless. Each one of them obeys a little local rule. It doesn't know the larger thing it is a part of. It has this very simple rule. This is competence without comprehension. We have the queen on the right, and she is not the boss. She's not the architect. There is no boss. There is no architect at all. The termite colony builds that termite hill without any instruction from a leader or a brilliant understander of the whole project. Now, in the case of Gaudí, it's just the opposite. He was paradigmatically an autocrat, a crazy genius, the inspired person, and he had the blueprints and the drawings and the plans and the rationales and the ideas. He had a whole philosophy to go with it, and he ordered people around. He directed this sort of hierarchical arrangement of builders and sub-builders and so forth. He was in charge. So this is the difference between bottom-up building and design and top-down building and design. Now, how do we get from the termites to Gaudí? How do we get to a human mind like Gaudí's? Well, let's do it gradually, building up in steps. Here's a caddis fly larva. Now, caddis fly larvae, not exactly geniuses, but they build rather beautiful structures. Here's a caddis larva food sieve. This is built in moving water, in fresh water, and as you can see, the water goes in the funnel at the top, and it passes through a sieve, a screen that the caddisfly creates, and the food sticks to the sieve, then the water exits out there. And there's also this nice little, if you look at the top view, you can see that there's a passageway so that the larva can get to both sides of the screen without going outside. And brilliant design. It compares very favorably with another device for getting food out of water, which also involves putting a screen and leaving the water behind, a lobster trap. Now, what's the difference between these two? Two food traps. Well, there are reasons for the arrangement of parts in the lobster trap. Manifestly, the lobstermen have been making these for a long time, and they figured out why. They know why the parts are where they are. There's good reasons why the parts are arranged as they are. But there are also reasons why the parts are the way they are in the caddis larva food sieve. The difference is that the caddis reasons are not represented anywhere. Until clever biologists come along and reverse engineer the sieve. And now for the first time, the reasons are articulated or represented. But they're not represented in the head of the caddis larva any more than they're represented in the head of the termite. And if they're not represented in the head of the caddis larva, then they're not represented. Because Mother Nature does not have a mind. Mother Nature is absolutely ignorant. Mother Nature, that is to say, natural selection, does not represent reasons. But natural selection discovers reasons all the time. Mother Nature, natural selection, tracks reasons, evinces reasons, and sharpens them by improving the design over time of everything from molecules, from proteins on up through to the caddis larva's food sieve and the wing of the eagle. Now, these reasons that evolution discovers, I call the free-floating rationales of evolution. This term gives some people the willies. They don't like it, and they think I'm playing fast and loose. If I had more time, I would very carefully defend this and say, look, biologists everywhere talk about function. They talk about the purpose of various parts, and they're right to do so. It goes all the way down to the proteins and their functions. And you can't really talk about functions without talking about the reasons, the raison d'etre, as one says in French, for those parts. Those are the reasons of biology, and until clever biologists come along and figure out the reasons and articulate them, they're not represented anywhere. Anywhere. That's part of Darwin's idea. One of my favorite examples is the cuckoo chick. Cuckoos, as you know, are what are called brood parasites. The cuckoo does not make her own nest. When she's ready to lay her egg, she finds a nest that's already been built by a host species, and the eggs have already been laid in that nest. She waits surreptitiously, waiting. When the host parents fly off to feed, she swoops down secretly in her wingsuit. She swoops down. She lays her egg, and she rolls one of the host eggs out. That's in case the hosts can count. Yeah? She flies away, never to return. The hosts come back, they incubate the eggs. the cuckoo chick hatches before the other eggs. And there's a reason for that too. The first thing that cuckoo chick does, it's blind, it's featherless, it's this scrawny little thing, is it works to push the other eggs out. Why? To get all the food. To maximize the investment, to exploit the hosts more. There are many examples of this host manipulation by parasite. This is one of the best. And if you look at the video, I'm not going to show the video I have a little video clip of this, but there's some on the web. These chicks are certainly purposeful. But when you see it, you can sort of feel a little better if you realize the chick doesn't know what he's doing. He knows not what he does. He's committing ovicide, but he doesn't know it. He is not aware of the reason why he is doing this. He doesn't have to be. He is the beneficiary of that reason in the same way that the caddis larva is, or for that matter, the oak tree is the beneficiary of a lot of reasons for its own design. These are not represented reasons. That's the big difference. There's a reason why the cuckoo rolls the egg when she lays her own. There's a reason why the cuckoo chick pushes out the egg when it hatches, but they don't have to be appreciated by the beneficiaries. We are different. We are the reason representers. We are the ones that ask why. Now Descartes, thinking about the human mind, said, well, it's because we are the only human beings that have an immaterial soul, a res cogitans, a thinking thing, an immortal soul. It was very convenient for him, of course, as a Jesuit, that he could sort of take the Catholic concept of an immaterial, immortal soul and say, yeah, that's the res cogitans, that's the res, and only we have, animals don't have them. So that sheep are just competent robots. He said that bravely in the 17th century, and his contemporary, a scientist named Arnaud, said, you're kidding me. Do you really think that the light bounces off the head of the wolf and into the sheep's eye and causes the sheep to flee, and that's just an automaton? And Descartes said, yeah, it is. You'd be amazed what you can do, in effect, with wires and pulleys. As an automaton. He said all animals are just automata. And automata can be very clever, but they can't do what we can do, which is what you're doing right now, listening to a conversation and getting it. The sort of understanding that we do with words, having a conversation, he says that is beyond any machine at all. That takes a res cogitans, an immortal soul. Well, he was almost right. Our immortal soul gives us the powers that are required for morality. We are the moral animal. If a bear kills a human being, that's not homicide, that's not murder. Because the bear does not understand what it's doing. We're the ones that can understand, and we're the only ones that can understand, and that's the sense in which we have a soul. I don't think it's immortal. Descartes was almost right. Now here's Descartes' famous drawing. I've put some graffiti on it. The light bounces off the arrow into the eyes, which causes actually, Descartes was brilliant. He had this tremendous imagination. He had what you might call the bicycle handbrake theory of nerve action, because he noticed the sheath on the nerves, and he sort of thought, if there's a wire in there, and you sort of pull here, you tug here, you could open a little valve into the ventricles. He thought the cerebrospinal fluid that Dr. Bertalanffy was talking about, he called that animal spirits, and he thought that was what pumped up the muscles when the hand goes up here, you see. You open a little valve, you pump, it has a hydraulic theory, muscle action. But what happens up there in that funny sort of teardrop shaped thing is he thinks that waves of vibration in the CSF, in the animal spirits, cause a little part of the brain, the pineal gland. It's the only part of the brain that you've just got one of. It's right in the middle. And that was for him the fax machine to the soul. If you vibrate that caused this sort of magical interaction out into the immaterial mind, where the consciousness of the arrow happens, and then that leads by free will, the soul decides to point at it. Then somehow the soul's decision to point has to be turned back into material energy. This is the famous, infamous Cartesian interactionistic dualism, and even Descartes realized this was hopeless. Well, he didn't. He realized it was a big problem, because conservation of energy. How does an immaterial anything create an acceleration in matter? Even he knew that there was the principle of the conservation of energy. So we've given up this Cartesian dualism. We're all materialists now. We think the mind is the brain. How can that be? Well, sheep are competent robots, so are we. We're just more competent. We don't have an immortal, immaterial race cogitans, but we do have a soul. We're much more competent than sheep. Some years ago, in Corriere della Sera, I was interviewed, in the headline the next day I just loved, and I've saved it and used it as a sort of motto ever since. Sì, abbiamo un'anima, ma è fatta di tanti piccoli robot. Yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots. That's my view exactly. Exactly. What are those robots? Well, they are neurons. Here's some neurons in action. Each neuron is the direct descendant of a free-swimming eukaryotic cell which fended for itself and its progeny for over 1 billion years. There's a lot of can-do there, a lot of competence without comprehension. Now they're trapped in a brain, but they're still looking for work, they're still active, they're still out there. They're little robots, little cellular robots, and if those aren't robots, then look inside further and you'll see they're made up of robots. You've got motor proteins and things like that, which are little non-living robots. It's robots all the way down. So we're made of trillions of mindless little robots and nothing else. No mystery stuff, no immaterial race cogitans. Now those little robots don't have free will, and not one of them knows who you are or cares. But you know, we know, and we care. So the task of having a theory of consciousness is, how do we get a team of trillions of robots to turn into something that knows and understands and cares? That's the problem for a theory of consciousness. How is it done? Not magic. Teamwork. But how does the teamwork happen? How does it get imposed on all these little individual agents? That's the problem. And how do we get from the bottom-up local rules design and construction that we saw in the termite hill to top-down global order design and construction of the sort that La Sagrada Familia illustrates? Now, this really is a tricky problem, because the more you look at the architecture of the brain, the more you realize that all those neurons in there, that is sort of like a termite colony. If a termite colony can't build La Sagrada Familia, how can the termite colony between your ears do it? There's more of them. There's a few 100 billion of them. But still, where do they get this extra level of perspective, this representational power? That's the question. And I'm going to try to explain that in a very short time by appealing to some evolutionary ideas. We've got to have an evolutionary answer to this. And John Maynard Smith, the late great John Maynard Smith, and Earth Zathmari, in a book of 1995, gives us some clues. They talk about the major transitions in evolution. A major transition is a point in evolutionary history where something happened, not miraculous. It happened just because it could happen, but it changed, it sort of shifted gears of evolution into a new, more efficient, more effective, more powerful process. And they list a bunch of them. I'm not going to list them all. Sex, you'll be pleased to know, is a major transition. Multicellularity, of course, is a major transition from having a single cell to being these huge, huge teamworks. And then there's language and human culture, and that's what I'm going to focus on because that's the key. But before I talk about that, I'm going to look at the first major transition because it gives us an important clue about the fifth one, the Eukaryotic Revolution. Here we have, oh, where is that pointer around? Oh, it is. Here we have a lovely slide of the tree of life. Every living thing that's ever lived is represented on this tree of life. Here's the beginning of life right here, about 3.5 billion years ago. And at first it's just bacteria and archaea. These are single-celled, simple single-celled organisms. Well, you know, bacteria. Eukaryotes, this is what we're talking about now, come along. They're single-celled too, and everything over here is a eukaryote. These are the multicelled. Basically, everything living that you can see with the naked eye is a eukaryote. So this is an important transition. Arriving at eukaryotes opened the way to everything from insects to trees to spiders to people. Here, right over here, maybe this is our common ancestor with the bonobo and the chimpanzee, and here we are out here. So now we want to explain this amazing moment, and it was, for all we know, it was a single moment in the history of life on this planet when the Eukaryotic Revolution happened. So what happened? Well, 2.5 billion years ago, but after there had been 1 billion years of prokaryotes, of bacteria and archaea. So we've had a lot of R&D, 1 billion years of R&D, but still we just got these little simple cells. So there were these simple prokaryotes, and one prokaryote was invaded by another prokaryote. So I want you to visualize this. Here's prokaryote A, and here's prokaryote B, and one day, boom, one prokaryote was invaded by another. B was invaded by A. Well, now this would have been happening presumably for a long time, and usually B would simply take A apart and use the raw materials. That's called eating. Or sometimes A would take B apart from the inside. That's called eating. Simple life for those prokaryotes. But on this occasion, neither one ate the other. And that is to say, the structure of A was not taken apart, not dissolved, but maintained, and what we got was a new thing, an AB thing. And look what happened. Two semi-independent R&D streams, 1 billion years long, were united in a moment. And you suddenly have a thing which has a whole lot more can-do than either A or B by itself. Teamwork of a very high order, uniting the can-do, the R&D from two completely different industries, if you like, in a single moment. And it was so much more fit than the other cells around that it prospered, and its offspring have both the A and the B. And in fact, the lovely fossil trace of that, you probably know this, but let me just remind you, you've heard of mitochondrial DNA. Every cell in your body, you're a eukaryote, has mitochondria, and they have their own genome. And the genes that they have, those are the genes that go back, those were the genes of A back in those days. And the genes of B are now in your so-called nuclear DNA. You have two genomes in every cell in your body. You have your nuclear genome, and then you have your mitochondrial genome. And you get your mitochondrial genes only from your mother. That's why we talk about mitochondrial Eve. Why? Because as it happens, the sperm doesn't carry any mitochondria. So the male does not contribute any of those mitochondrial genes to your genome. You get all your mitochondrial genes from your mother. Okay. The result was a more complicated cell that was fitter. Because eukaryotes are so much more talented, more versatile, this made multicellular life possible. Now you can see maybe where I'm going with this. Something similar happened to us which made not multicellular, but multi-personal projects like building cathedrals and things like that possible, thanks to a similarly radical thing that happened in the fifth transition, the language and human culture one. And they go together, and language is the most important because human culture depends on it. So this is the transition that I want to talk about. We have the dog on the right. It's got a nice brain. But the guy has words. And in particular, he has the word why. And that's a word you get in every language one way or another, and it is a deeply important word because it asks for a reason. So now we want to look at how words got started. Like the Eukaryotic Revolution, the human culture revolution permitted the sudden acquisition of huge gifts of design. We all have minds that are beautifully furnished with not just arithmetic and long division and cost-benefit analysis on how to read a map and different languages and the history of the symphony. And we can ransack the world's culture and all put it in our head. Very important, you don't eat it. You know? You get somebody's book and you eat the book and you've thrown away all the design work. You want to keep the structure because that's where all the R&D is in the design. This permitted the evolution of a new kind of mind. And it's just as dramatic a development as the Eukaryotic Revolution. In the last 10,000 years, the human population, plus our livestock and pets, have gone from a fraction of 1% of the total terrestrial biomass of the planet, under 1%. 10,000 years ago, human beings, their cattle, their domesticated animals and pets was less than 1% of the total terrestrial vertebrate biomass, the animals. We're leaving the insects and the worms out of this and the fish in the sea. Today, do you know what it is? What's the percentage today, 10,000 years later? 98. 98%. We have engulfed the planet. Isn't that astonishing? That is a biological fact of stunning suddenness, and it's all due to culture. We are not genetically different from our ancestors of 10,000 years ago, hardly at all. We are culturally extremely different from our ancestors. Now, I've showed you a phylogenetic tree, the tree of life. Long before there were phylogenetic trees, there were glossogenetic trees worked out by linguists, historical linguists. Here's the tree of languages. We see the Indo-European branch of the language tree. The larger tree is shown in the lower left. Here's the Finno-Ugric languages. Here's the languages of China. I just went on the web and found some nice language trees. Proto-Mayan languages. Now, a feature of languages that you know perfectly well is what we might call horizontal word transfer. It's rife in languages. What that means is that words move easily from language to language. Thus, English has lots of French and German words, and French, in spite of trying to prevent it, you know, le weekend and all the rest, they've taken in a lot of English words. Words can move around between languages in a remarkable way, which raises hob with doing the language trees. It makes it really hard to do this. But the same thing is true in genes. Words are more trackable items than whole languages. We can do the lineage of a word more securely than we can do the lineage of a language. We can trace it back, you know, back into French and then into Latin and then into some earlier perhaps it even had a cognate in ancient Greek, or we can go back further still. I call this horizontal word transfer deliberately to make the parallel with what happens in genes, where the big topic these days is horizontal gene transfer. This is a lovely tree drawn by Ford Doolittle. This is showing the early days of eukarya and bacteria and archaea. Remember the first part of that tree of life. And as you can see, it's all higgledy-piggledy because you have a lot of anastomosis, a lot of things branching together rather than branching apart. Now, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins was published in 1976, and in that he introduced the concept of memes. And that's what I have a few minutes more. As cultural items analogous to genes, in that they were independent replicators that could be traced in the same way we can trace genes. Or to viruses. Very important that he added viruses. Why? Because viruses are, by most people's definition, they don't count as, they're not alive. They're just large molecules. But they sure do evolve. HIV has evolved more since it was first sequenced simply more changes to its genome than have been recorded since we parted company from our common ancestor with the chimpanzee. So evolution does not require living things. Viruses evolve and they're not alive. They evolve by natural selection. Natural selection. So now we're a topic of memes. A lot of people really don't like the idea of memes. I know both scientists who don't like the concept, biologists who don't like it. They think it's awfully cultural, yeah. Or it's just too vague, they think, or it's only metaphorical. I think that's wrong. And a lot of people in the Geisteswissenschaften, they really don't like the idea because they see it as biology, natural sciences encroaching into their domain of culture, and they don't want to see this at all. So there's a lot of skepticism about memes. A lot of people say, well, let me first say this. They're analogous to genes or to viruses. I've already said this. Here's my motto. A virus is a string of nucleic acid with attitude. Its attitude is all in its shape. Shape, remember, is the result of R&D. It's the design. It doesn't know what it's doing, but it has this tremendous competence, without comprehension, of getting into a cell and taking over that cell's reproductive machinery and getting the cell to make more copies of it rather than of its own DNA. That's how viruses replicate. A meme is similarly a data structure made of information with attitude. It's not alive, it doesn't understand what it's doing, but it has a competence too. The competence to provoke minds to make copies of them. Just like a virus. Well, are there any memes? Sometimes I get this skepticism. I don't even know if there's. Prove to me that there's memes. Now you know what the first slide is about. Words are memes that can be pronounced. There are other memes, like wearing your baseball cap backwards or a particular sort of handshake. You can't pronounce those. They're memes too. But words are the preeminent memes. They're the obvious memes. And we know even their evolutionary history. We know those language trees. We know how these words have evolved. And they've evolved by natural selection, not by people trying to change them. The words have mutated over time by a process that people are largely oblivious to. For evolution to occur, copying must be high fidelity, but not perfect. This is a fundamental principle of evolutionary theory. Well, is this true of words? And the answer is yes, it is. What do you see? Say it. The cat. Oh, yeah, but now look. The H and the A are exactly the same shape. You automatically, competently, and without comprehension, without knowing why you were doing it or what, you fixed those letters. You let context fix them. The same thing happens in your genes. We have proofreading enzymes that do that kind of work in your genes when they're copying the genes. That's how the fidelity stays so high when they're copying your genes. Well, that's, of course, written language. How about spoken language? I'm going to show you, demonstrate to you a little experiment that it also works for spoken language. So listen carefully. I want you to repeat after me something I'm going to say. Are you ready? Mundify the epigastrium. Again? One more time. All right. Do you know what it means? No, you don't have to. That's case number one. Second one. Repeat after me. Are you ready? Come on. And again? You can't do it. Why not? It was just as loud. If you examined the acoustic signals, it would be just as many peaks and valleys, just as robust a physical signal, but you do not have in your head an automatic system of correction to the norm, just like the turning the H and the A, but now in the auditory domain. Use a set number, a finite number of phonemes, like letters of the alphabet, and you move to the nearest, the most appropriate letter automatically without trying, and that's how come you can hear, and you don't even have to know what the words mean. It is this feature, this digitization of spoken language, which is true of all languages, that is the key to the fact that languages permit human culture, and only human culture, to ramify and to explode in cultural evolution. There is cultural evolution in chimpanzees, for instance, and a little bit in whales, been demonstrated, but it never takes off. And the reason is it can't take off because you can't build large structures that will preserve their integrity because you don't have the high fidelity copying. You don't have the digitization. It's a trick that was first learned by evolution in creating the digital code, DNA, A, C, G, T, or U in the early days with RNA. Just a few simple letters, they get copied again and again. It's digitization. It's the same reason that your computer is a high fidelity, reliable machine. Norms of correction are not just for words and not just for genes. Information about canoes is stored in the brains of Polynesians, of course, but also in their canoes. Each canoe is a storehouse of information in its own right, but only on the default presumption that the design is good. It is itself a norm of itself, even if it isn't understood. Well, I'm just making it the way my father made it and the way my grandfather made it. I don't know why, but this is the way we make canoes. Here's a nice passage from Alain. Every boat is copied from another boat. It is the sea herself who fashions the boats, choosing those which function and destroying the others. If it comes back, copy it. That's evolution by natural selection, in a nutshell, right there. If it comes back, copy it. That's what nature does, and that's what people do, but that's not genetic natural selection, that's cultural natural selection. And that's how words and other memes, including how to build canoes, that's how they propagate. So, memes are like software viruses. In fact, memes are software viruses, and if I had more time, I would go in, I would really defend this in some length. I'm going to just give you a little hint. They're like Java applets. If you know what that means, then you already understand me. I don't have time to explain it. To understand this, you need to adjust your imagination about computation and software. Words are what a software engineer would call virtual machines. That's what a Java applet is too. What's a word made of? Remember, we all agreed there's words. Yeah, but what are they made of? Letters. Yeah, but what are letters made of? Sounds. See, they're so familiar, but they're not an ordinary physical thing. You can't talk about what atoms go to make them up, or, or how much they weigh, or anything like that. They are abstract objects. They're just as abstract as a melody or a software application, a software. They are made of information. My wonderful colleague Ray Jackendoff, one of the world's great linguists, in his wonderful book Foundations of Language, since he's a formal linguist, he has to call them lexical items instead of words. Well, because there's all sorts of problems with, is ing, as in jumping, running, is ing a word, or is jump and jumping, is that two words or one? There's reasons for having the term lexical items. He describes them as semi-autonomous informational structures with multiple roles to play in cognition. Doesn't that sound like a bit of software? It is a bit of software, but it's not software that runs on a laptop. It's not binary software. It's software that's designed by evolution to run on your necktop. Words are virtual machines. Who designed them? Evolution. Cultural evolution, not genetic evolution. We are not born knowing our words. We don't get our language through our genes. We get our language from culture. There are genetic responses. Certainly our brain is different from the brain of our nearest relatives, the chimpanzees and the bonobos, in lots of ways which are due to the fact that our ancestors developed language. And this created selection pressures that the brain responded to in evolutionary time to make it a better word processor. And how are they installed? Well, you can't just download it the way you can a Java applet, but almost. It's by repetition. Now, my good friend Doug Hofstadter, with whom I did a book some years ago, some of you may know, The Mind's Eye, in one of his recent books, he gives a little toolkit. These are just some virtual machines in his kit. And these are terms. Let's look at them. Wild goose chases, tackiness, dirty tricks, sour grapes, elbow grease, feet of clay, loose cannons, crackpots, lip service, slam dunks, feedback. What are these? Each one of those is a little thinking tool. If you've got it, you can think more efficiently, more effectively. There's a categorization you can make. There's a set of inferences that you will be disposed to make. It will remind you of things to think about. It will raise questions in your mind. These are good. These are useful thinking tools, and he's downloaded them all, and they're all in his kit. Words make possible the recessive transmission of information. Marco Polo, they say, brought pasta back from the Far East. And the Italians can be thankful for that. We can all be thankful for pasta. But notice, he didn't have to become a pastry chef. He didn't have to become a pasta maker. He only had to bring the recipes. He didn't have to execute them themselves. Words also help us use and transmit information that we don't understand. Let me prove it to you. How many of you believe, oh, this is good, this was on here today. How many of you believe that E equals MC squared? Yeah, come on. You ought to. It's true. How many of you understand it? Yeah, some of us do. I've got to tell a very quick story. I was using that example in a talk I was giving about memes at Fermilab. An audience a little bit bigger than this, most of them, you know, world-class physicists and engineers. So I said, how many of you, I have a slide, E equals MC squared. I said, how many of you believe this? All the hands go up. How many of you understand it? All the hands go up. So I said, well, this is not really the right example for this crowd, I guess. But one fellow jumped up and he says, no, it's perfect, because the experimentalists only think they understand it. We theoreticians are the ones that understand it. Which was actually the point I wanted to make. Which is that the very fact that we don't have to understand words completely is what permits a wonderful division of labor. We do the believing and leave the understanding to the experts. And we all use formulae that we have only an incomplete grasp of. We don't completely understand the reasons. We only semi-understand these things. And yet we can use them with confidence because we know there's somebody in the next building who really does understand them all the way down. And so it goes. Doug is the author of a wonderful book, a very strange and wonderful book called I Am a Strange Loop. And I think he's the best sort of speculative theorist about how minds, how brains can come to be minds dominated by an idea or by ideas, how memes come to change the operating system, if you like, by building more and more layers of virtual machine. Everybody in this room has a laptop that has a JVM on it, a Java virtual machine. That's how come you don't even know it's there. It permits you to download Java applets. The people who write Java applets don't have to know what kind of a computer you have, because you all have the JVM. You also all have the EVM, the English virtual machine. That's how come you can take this talk in, and you don't have to work that hard. You get all of these new things to think about because you've already installed a fairly recent version of the EVM, and it permits you to take in all of these memes that I'm giving you here and do things with them right away. And this is the fulcrum of intelligent design. Now, this is the Pilot Ace, 1950. This is Turing's computer. It was, I think it had, less than 500 32-bit words of RAM. That was it, that room full of computer. Amazing. That is the epitome of top-down design. Nobody would have put up the millions of pounds it took to make that machine if Turing hadn't proven the concepts and if they had the blueprints and the rationale and it had all been worked out. This is representation first design and construction, if there ever was it. The farthest thing in the world from what the termites do. In other words, we are the first intelligent designers in the tree of life. Our natural tendency, of course, is to interpret all design as top-down. That's the old pre-Darwinian way of doing it, as representation-driven, and this is both anachronistic and anthropocentric. We're using ourselves, the first intelligent designers ever, as the model for the earlier design processes. Seems I've read that somewhere, but it's false. No. No. Words are a very recent invention, evolutionarily speaking. Just in the last million years at the outside. It's one of the most recent products of blind, purposeless natural selection. We, the reason representers, can now look back and discover the reasons everywhere in the tree of life. It took Darwin to figure out that a mindless process discovered all those reasons. We intelligent designers are among the effects, not the cause, of all those purposes. Thanks for your attention.